You wake up in Delhi in 2026, and the flag above the old secretariat building is still the Union Jack. Your identity card lists you as a subject, not a citizen. There was no Independence Day here, not in 1947, not ever. For nearly 200 years, this was not a fantasy. It was policy, written into tax ledgers, survey maps, and railway timetables, one line at a time. What if that policy had simply never ended? Start with the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story. In 1700, India's share of world economic output stood close to 24%, according to economic historian Angus Maddison, whose historical GDP estimates are still the baseline researchers use today. By 1947, that share had collapsed to under 4%. Now imagine a version of the 20th century where the machine that caused that collapse simply kept running, uninterrupted, into your own morning commute. You live under a system with no expiration date. Every road beneath your feet was surveyed by the Great Trigonometrical Survey, a project so vast it took decades to complete. It gave the world the exact height of Mount Everest, a peak later named after one of the survey's own superintendents, George Everest, who never even saw the mountain that carries his name. The survey wasn't neutral. It was never meant to be. Rivers, mountain passes, farmland, forest boundaries, all of it measured so an empire could tax it precisely, move troops through it quickly, and defend it without hesitation. Geography, in this story, was never just scenery. It was infrastructure for control. Now picture your daily life inside that surviving empire. Your school still teaches from a curriculum shaped in London. Your civil service exam, the one exam that decides whether you can ever hold real administrative power, is still modeled on the old Indian civil service exam. Until 1922, that exam could only be sat in London itself. A journey of roughly 4 months by sea for anyone in India hoping to compete for their own country's government. How many futures were decided before a single candidate even asked a question? You commute past a border that, in this timeline, was never drawn. There is no Radcliffe line, because there was no partition to draw it for. In actual history, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe was given just 5 weeks in the summer of 1947 to divide British India into 2 new nations. He had never set foot in India before receiving the assignment. Working from outdated maps and incomplete census data, he split the provinces of Punjab and Bengal directly down the middle. An estimated 15 million people crossed that new line within months. Historians place the death toll from the violence that followed above 1 million people. In your surviving empire timeline, none of that catastrophe happens, but not because peace was found. It happens because there was never an exit to walk through in the first place. So let's recreate one of your actual days inside that world. You wake before dawn to reach the district office early, because European officials are still processed first in the queue. You carry a travel permit for movement between provinces, a wartime restriction from the 1940s that was supposed to be temporary and simply never expired. You see a British officer's car approaching on a narrow road, and you step aside, not because a written law tells you to, but because generations of habit already trained your body to do it before your mind finishes the thought. Your grandmother remembers a version of this exact scene. Yours has never known anything else. Walk a little further into that same day. At the market, prices for salt are still set by a colonial monopoly, the same kind of monopoly that once made salt itself an act of resistance. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi led thousands of people on a 240-mile walk to the coastal town of Dandi to make salt by hand, defying a British law that taxed and controlled its production. That march became one of the defining images of the entire independence movement. In your timeline, there was no independence movement left to remember it as history. There is only the tax, still collected, still ordinary, still invisible to anyone who has never known a world without it. Would you even recognize resistance if it happened around you? Or would 2 centuries of routine make it look like just another Tuesday? Here's the counterintuitive twist, and it changes the entire shape of this story. An empire that never loses India doesn't necessarily stay strong. It might stay trapped. British geographer Halford Mackinder argued in his Heartland theory that whoever controlled the vast interior of Eurasia controlled the world, and that India functioned as the strategic base for projecting British power across the rest of Asia. Holding India in that framework was the empire's insurance policy against long-term decline. But holding territory by force is never free. The cost of controlling hundreds of millions of people, generation after generation, does not stay fixed at one price. It compounds. Could the empire that won by simply never letting go actually be the empire that eventually collapsed under its own accumulated weight? Every rebellion suppressed requires more troops for the next one. Every strike broken requires a larger police budget the following year. The 1919 massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, where troops under the command of General Reginald Dyer opened fire on an unarmed crowd, was meant to demonstrate total control. Instead, in actual history, it became one of the clearest turning points that pushed the independence movement forward, hardening opinion against colonial rule for decades afterward. In a timeline where independence never arrives, does that same turning point simply repeat, decade after decade, forever, with a new name and a new date each time? Now bring it back to the map you would actually be standing on. No Pakistan, no Bangladesh, no India as a sovereign, nuclear-armed power with a seat pursued at the United Nations Security Council and a functioning space program of its own. Instead, one enormous colonial administrative zone, its internal provinces redrawn again and again, not by the people living inside them, but by whichever government in London needed a new arrangement that particular decade. Would you even call that one country? Or would you call it a very large, very old holding pattern that simply never resolved? This is where the historical mirror gets sharp enough to feel uncomfortable. Empires rarely end because they run out of soldiers. They end because holding on stops being cheaper than letting go. Britain's actual withdrawal from India in 1947 was never pure generosity. It followed a treasury bankrupted by 2 world wars, a mutiny within the Royal Indian Navy in February 1946 involving thousands of sailors, and a growing recognition among British policymakers that the cost of continued control now outweighed the value of the colony itself. Historian and former United Nations official Shashi Tharoor has documented how the economic drain from India to Britain ran in one direction for nearly 2 centuries, a pattern that eventually became difficult to justify even to people back in Britain. An empire that never lost India would have had to solve a problem the real empire never solved. How do you make control profitable forever on a subcontinent large enough to eventually outpopulate the very country ruling it? Nobody has ever solved that problem. Not the Mongols, at the furthest edge of their conquest. Not Rome, stretched thin along its frontiers, eventually splitting in 2 just to remain governable. Not the Ottomans, governing provinces from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula that they could never fully digest. And that eventually broke apart along the same ethnic and religious lines the empire had spent centuries trying to manage. Every one of those empires believed, at their peak, that size itself was the proof of permanence. Every one of them was wrong. So maybe the real question was never whether the empire could have kept India a little longer. Maybe it's whether any empire, anywhere, can hold something that large without eventually being reshaped by the very thing it's holding. Sit with that thought for a moment, because it stops feeling like ancient history fairly quickly. Every institution you live inside today is being asked some version of the same question. Your workplace, your government, your platform of choice, your city as it grows past the infrastructure built to hold it. How much can you control before the thing you're controlling starts controlling you back? Think about the last time you tried to hold on to something past the point it still made sense. A job, a relationship, a habit, a plan. Did letting go actually cost you more than holding on ever did? Empires answer that question on a continental scale. You answer it every year of your own life, usually without noticing. You woke up this morning under someone else's flag. By the time this ends, you start to wonder whose flag was ever really flying.